That was a little overkill on the graphics there. I realized that at the second that I did that. So if you couldn't tell, we're axioms on trial if you didn't see by the 6 different things that told you so. We are back, and we're gonna do just a I guess a little discussion on a various amount of topics we'll cover. I think mainly we'll do metaethics, cease as a realist. Kane, if you're not familiar with Kane already, go check him out at Kane B on YouTube. A lot of really, that's like honestly like me getting into philosophy was spending a lot of time on Kane's videos to help me understand what the fuck I was reading. so I really appreciate Kane for diving into the depths of YouTube. And I think you said you just did it because you wanted to help yourself as you were going along, and so I'm glad that you made that move because it helped a lot of other people along the way. So yeah, we'll cover all that, and I'll hand it to Cease. And I don't know if you want to introduce Kane and then get started on the metaethics topic.
Yeah, Kane, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? First of all, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Wanting to set this up for a while, so I appreciate your time. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking me. Well, I guess there's not really that much to say about me. I mean, I have been interested in philosophy for a long time. I have a YouTube channel which has been going on for many years now, on which I upload videos on philosophy. I did a philosophy degree, philosophy masters, and my PhD. And well, yeah, that's my background, and I'm just continuing to, read philosophy, make videos, and that's about it. I don't have a very interesting life, but
well, I feel like
it.
if you're like me, I don't like if I ever go on other people's channels, I don't like the intro parts. I usually just like, can we skip that stuff? Because like I'm not a very interesting person, like at all. you will be like thoroughly disappointed. You just like ask Rebecca or Ruxter or Amdy or anybody, and like yeah, nothing special.
Oh yeah, I mean, if people want to know what I'm all about, I guess like just go and look at the channel. That's sort of what I do. And then in my free time, I just I sort of sit in my room, which you can see behind me here.
Yeah,
that is my life.
So, well, I would say spending time reading philosophy is a pretty interesting way to spend your life. So I think that's a cool thing. That's what I do too. So, but yeah, I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was if you could provide us with kind of your perspective on meta-ethics and what is your position about it, if you have a position. And
okay, sure. I mean, well, with respect to my own position, I've always been on the more anti-realist side. It's probably the one significant philosophical position I've held that I just haven't changed my mind on since, before even getting into philosophy seriously. I mean, I remember being like 12 years old before I'd read any academic philosophy, and it just seemed really obvious to me that morality, moral judgments, they're the sorts of things that are, invented, not discovered. It just seemed really clear, like, yeah, this is fundamentally different to a claim like Mount Everest is the tallest mountain on Earth or whatever. And so that was just my intuition, before even reading any of the literature. And then when I started reading philosophy, I found myself totally unconvinced by any of the arguments for realism, so I didn't budge. I think that my current view, though, is, well, probably in some ways quite like pessimistic about the state of metaethics, because I mean, if you were to, so the thing is that I simply don't think there are any good arguments one way or the other. So I don't think there are any good arguments for realism, but I'm not really sure there are any good arguments for anti-realism. Although like I don't feel like I have any reason to change my mind. I also don't feel like I have much to offer somebody on the opposing side to get them to change their mind. It seems to me that both options are rationally permissible, and neither of them have much to be said in their favor. So I suppose that might sound like a somewhat pessimistic attitude, but I don't know. I don't really see it that way, actually, because I quite like it when philosophy leads us to the position that, well, maybe we just don't know and we don't really have any good reasons for anything.
Would you classify your anti-realist in a way that I think Lance has been on record of saying, this is my position as well, is a kind of a response to realism, that you're just not convinced that there are stance-independent moral facts, or that you think that the claim that there are stance-independent moral facts is false or incoherent or trivial, or turns out to be trivial? Or how, is it more of like a response to the project, in a sense, and that's why you kind of lean towards this? There's not really good arguments for anti-realism because it's more of a response to the project, a failed project of realism, or how are you viewing that?
No, not exactly. I mean, I think it would be, so if I was to say, well, this is merely a response to realism, then I don't think that, I wouldn't really call myself an anti-realist in that case, because obviously one can just suspend judgment, right? And I mean, in some sense, you might say that suspending judgment is a kind of anti-realism. Fair enough, but you know, that I would want to distinguish between like somebody who denies that there are stance-independent moral facts, or you know, somebody who even has like positive reasons for suspending judgment about whether or not there are moral facts, from somebody who just looks at the state of metaethics and says, well, I just don't know. I have no
Sure.
opinion. I have no position. Now, so my stance here is, I'm quite happy to just say, yeah, you know what, I am an anti-realist, because I believe that there are no stance-independent moral facts, but that's something of a sort of leap of faith on my part. You know, if I was to, maybe I could say, like, if I was to try to, you know, dispassionately assess the arguments in metaethics, I think I'd probably end up coming down on the position of, well, I just don't know. I don't even have a position. It's not even worth giving it a name. Like, you know, that would probably be what I would say.
So you like have
I don't even try to do that. I'm happy to, you know, plant a flag even when there aren't conclusive reasons. And so I want to plant my flag in the anti-realist camp. And there's that.
So you like, you'd put, you're kind of saying, like, you know, push comes to shove, you'd probably place the credence at 0.5 or something like that, like if it really came to it. But like, you know, in everyday speak, I mean, you're convinced, so you would say you're obviously the credence and then believing the proposition is higher than 0.5, but ultimately you would want to say, look, I don't think that we're getting underneath any of these deep philosophical issues.
Yeah, I mean, look, if we want to put it in terms of credences, I guess I wouldn't call myself like a subjective Bayesian, but one of the things that Bayesians like to say, at least subjective Bayesians like to say, is that your prior probabilities can be absolutely anything as long as they are, you know, consistent with the axioms of probability theory or whatever. I suppose I maybe have a similar view. I think it's perfectly fine for somebody to just have a, you know, high credence in moral anti-realism, even if they can't give a justification for it. And it goes the other way too. It's perfectly fine for somebody to have a high credence in moral realism, even if they can't give a justification for it.
I have a lot of
I think I understand. Yeah,
I have a lot of concerns with the Bayesian approach to that kind of thing. I never understood where they get their priors from, like their approach to their priors. But it's interesting. You said your intuition from the get-go was one of anti-realism. My intuition from the get-go, before I read anything, was exactly the opposite. Was that it always seemed to me kind of obvious in a sense that when we're talking about morality, there is something concrete there. And now I've been accused of being an anti-realist from other anti-realists, but I don't think that's the case. And I want to provide you with what kind of my perspective is on this, and you can tell me where you think the flaws in my argument are. Mentioned to you backstage where we were talking that one of my interests is phenomenology, and I take that approach to the question of morality in the sense that I think when we're talking about moral facts, we're talking about the kind of actions that will lead us to either suffer or flourish, and that these are not arbitrary, these are not baseless, but these are states of consciousness that we can discover by examining the brain, by examining aspects of phenomenology, and that it's not that it's independent of minds, but it's independent of mere opinion, culture, and stances. Meaning that somebody can have a stance about how to accomplish well-being and just turn out to be incorrect on the matter. The same way that, like, somebody came along and said, their belief is that they could become a bodybuilder by eating McDonald's all day long. Like, they could have that stance, but it wouldn't play out in the facts of the matter, like facts about nutrition and physiology. I think the same thing applies to morality. That there are strategies about how to engage in the world that will lead us to one end of the spectrum or the other, and that to ask, is well-being good, is a question that doesn't make sense to me. When I think about how we use language, at least in this context, we categorize different kinds of experiences as inherently pleasurable or painful, to kind of make it more basic. And then we just describe, like, this is what I mean by good. Like, I'm seeking this kind of experience. I'm not seeking this other kind of experience. Does any of that make any sense?
Yeah. I mean, I think I follow.
And so I for some reason, people think that this is like an anti-realist position. I don't think that it is, because I'm not diminishing morality to just mere stances. I'm saying there is something deeper that gives rise to the stances, which is what I call this kind of phenomenological nature. What do you think what flaws do you see in this approach, if any?
I mean, honestly, what you said there, maybe I misunderstood it. Everything you said. So, well, I mean, there's a couple of things that maybe we could distinguish. But so one of the things you pointed out was, well, look, there are these states of pleasure and pain, right? There's suffering and happiness, and I don't know, whatever you want to label them. And then there's facts of the matter about how to achieve these different states. And of course, I can be wrong about that. Like, let's say I'm really thirsty and I see, there's what looks like a glass of water in front of me, but actually it's poisoned or something. Well, if I then drink the glass of water, I think it's going to give me pleasure, but it won't. It'll cause me to suffer. I mean, so I don't really see in there so far anything that would be inconsistent with anti-realism. Like, obviously anti-realists aren't going to deny that, well, maybe some of them would, but I imagine most anti-realists aren't going to deny that people experience different states of consciousness. There are some states that they find enjoyable and some states they dislike, and then there's means to achieving these different states. I mean, there's certain actions you can perform that will lead you to experience more pleasure or more pain. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really see anything. Yeah.
This is kind of where I'm at in it, is that, I mean, and CISA is, I'm sure this, you obviously don't see it this way, and so I want you to kind of give your thoughts on it, obviously. But it's like when those facts, I think an error theory, or just like someone like myself could accept that, but it's not satisfying like an independent standard that I ought maximize well-being or something like that, which is what I'm taking the realist project to be doing. Kane, would that be fair to say, like, what like how you see it is that, like, an anti-realist could agree with these facts that you're pointing that lead to well-being, but it doesn't satisfy this independent standard that we ought maximize well-being or have this phenomenal state or something like that.
Mike, I think you're echoing.
Am I echoing?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know. Oh, sorry. Let me. I think I put it on speaker. Let me. Yeah, you go ahead. I'll mute.
So I guess there's maybe two things. So, like, one is, is it the case that there's some sort of independent, categorical reason to that, like, we ought to maximize pleasure, say, like, if I for instance, so let's take the person who says, well, sure, I recognize that performing this action is going to lead me to experience more pain overall, right? But I'm going to do it anyway. I just don't care, right? Like, is that person making an error? And I find it difficult to see where the error would be. So, for example, there's there's a case in metaethics of future Tuesday indifference, where we're asked to imagine somebody who just is completely indifferent to what happens to them on Tuesdays, in like future Tuesdays. Now, when Tuesday rolls around, they will experience just as much pleasure and pain. But like, if you were to say to them, well, you can either sort of have a dentist appointment with with anesthetic on the Wednesday, or a dentist appointment without anesthetic on the Tuesday, they would choose the dentist appointment without anesthetic on the Tuesday, because they say, well, I just don't care about what happens to me on Tuesdays. Now, that person is very strange. But to me, I think, well, if they can sort of recognize the facts about what will lead them to experience pleasure and pain, so they agree, they know, they're like, yes, I will experience pain on the Tuesday, I will hate it at the time, but I just don't care about that. I don't see that they're making any error, right? And I think that part of the project of something like moral realism would be to show that there really is some sort of error being made by someone who says that sort of thing. The other thing, I suppose, is that, even if famously in metaethics, there's this is-ought gap, but I think there's also what I would call a kind of value-ought gap, which is, even if we can, get on board with some sort of claim about objective value, it seems to me there's a further question about what we ought to do. So, like, I can say, okay, fine, it's objectively, like, pleasure is objectively valuable, but I don't see why that in itself would entail that I ought to act in such a way as to maximize pleasure. That just seems to be a different question, which of course is not going to be answered by just saying that, okay, pleasure is what is valuable. And so, yeah, that's maybe,
so a couple things.
I suppose I would maybe want a bit more from the real.
A couple of things to that. The first I wanted to respond to what you said about kind of the moral anti-realists, because you're saying that they wouldn't have an objection to the kind of framework I provided, but it seems to me that the difference lies in the idea that they're claiming that what can be judged as moral or immoral is going to be dependent on the stance itself, whereas I'm saying the stance is secondary to something else. It's not so much the stance, it's the nature. We can have different stances, but it's the nature that gives rise to the different stances that matter. And I don't know, when you said that even if we could agree that well-being was objectively good.
Hello?
Yes, can you
hear me back? Everything just disappeared for, like, I don't know, about 30 seconds.
oh dang, sorry. Yes, maybe you want to back up to
sure.
The beginning of that, where you're talking about it being stances being secondary to the nature.
Sure. So I'll go over that. Sorry. So the first thing you said was that the framework for morality that I provided was consistent with anti-realism, and you said that the anti-realist wouldn't necessarily have an issue with what I provided. But the difference that I see is that the anti-realist, and certainly the subjectivist, is reducing our judgment of right and wrong to the individual stance, whereas I'm saying stances can exist on a spectrum, but there's a deeper nature that is what matters, not so much the stance. Because I think it's possible to value the wrong thing by virtue of not having all the facts about your potential phenomenological experience. And I don't really understand what you mean when you say, even if we were to agree that morality, or that that well-being was objectively good, why we ought to value it. It seems to me that understanding that it is objectively good is why we ought to value it, that oughts are always concerned with goals. So I don't buy the is-ought distinction. I mean, maybe on a logical sense, yes, but in a practical sense, I think oughts are always concerned with goals. And so in the moral context, what we mean by what we ought to do is what actions will maximize this kind of experience. And if somebody says, I don't care about experiencing well-being, okay, people can say that. But to me, it's like saying, somebody can say, I don't care about my health. And that's fine. But then they can't, call themselves healthy while eating McDonald's every day. Like there's going to be like a category that's going to kind of symbolize what this concept means, and you're either going to be part of the project or not. And so I don't know that the person who says I don't care about well-being, I don't know that that's a problem for my worldview necessarily. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, if you think that there are moral facts, then whether or not people care about them is not going to be particularly relevant, right? It could be a fact that there are certain things we morally ought to do, but okay, people can care about it or not. But I mean, so I suppose, like, I guess the thing is though, is that I'm not sure what we're being offered beyond the claim about how to achieve particular ends. So like, okay, there are states of pleasure, there are states of pain, there are particular ways of gaining pleasure, particular things we can do that will lead to pain. And my question would be, well, okay, so where's the error then in somebody just sort of deciding not to pursue pleasure? I don't really see any error there. I should clarify with respect to when I mentioned the is-ought thing. So I sometimes talk about this, the value-ought thing. Like, so claims about what's valuable don't in themselves entail claims about what we ought to do. And I mean, one way that to see this is to think, well, there could be sort of alternative moral theories that make exactly the same claims about what sorts of states are valuable. So you might think, for instance, that like, life is valuable. Like life is one of the good things and death is one of the bad things. But then different moral theories can make different claims about how we ought to act with respect to those values. So somebody who's a utilitarian would say, well, you just maximize, right? Like you maximize life, or at least some types of lives, the lives that are sufficiently pleasurable. But then somebody who's, on the more sort of Kantian deontological side would say, well, sure, life is valuable, but like there are certain constraints on how we can act in such a way that you're not going to always maximize it. So with respect to the sort of moral realism thing, I'm just saying that, there's sort of there's two respects in which we might be realists, right? We can be realists about the value claim and then realists about the ought claim, and I don't think that one entails the other. But again, maybe
you'd be saying something like, imagine we had like a moral fact detector machine that spits out the moral fact, and it's presented to somebody, and this is the stance independent obligation, but there's just a gap from the value that one has to the obligation to actually do it. Is that what you're getting at?
So it seemed like the claim being made was that, okay, like pleasure is good, pleasure is what's valuable, right? Or well-being is good, well-being is what's valuable. But merely having an objective value, I don't think that in itself entails anything about what we ought to do. I think something further would have to be said.
As far as what strategy we implement to reach it, or the idea that we should care about reaching that end.
It's like a value ought gap, right? It's like there's an is ought gap, but then there's this further value to ought gap, right? Is that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I just don't see so I can just, it could be the case. It seems to me that it could be the case that there are objective values, but there's just nothing we objectively ought to do. So yeah.
I think there's a disconnect for me there. Like I can understand if what you mean is, even if we can recognize that there is this state of being that is inherently pleasurable and that we inherently value because of what it feels like to be in that state, that we might have competing theories about how to get to that state, which would lead to some kind of underdetermination of how we ought to navigate.
No.
You're saying something different.
No, I'm not saying that. So, I mean, obviously, we would presumably have different theories about how to get to that state, but that's not what I'm saying. So I'm saying that, okay, if you take, like, so a utilitarian and a Kantian could both completely agree that life is good, right? So they're going to take it that life is a valuable state. Life is good. Now, then the question is, well, how do we act with respect to that value? So one way to put this is, do we honor or promote the value? So a utilitarian will promote it. They'll just try to create as much of the valuable thing as possible, even if that means, so like it might be the case that one way in which you could maximize life is by actively destroying some lesser part of life. So like, you know, you destroy some life, but that maximizes life overall. I mean, there are situations where, you know, killing one person will save a greater number of people. So if you're concerned with promoting the value, with maximizing the value, you will sometimes act in such a way as to destroy the thing that you take to be valuable. Whereas a Kantian might say, well, no, you can never do that, right? So the Kantian agrees with the utilitarian about what's valuable, but the Kantian will say, no, you can't, you know, push the fat man off the bridge in order to stop the trolley that's heading towards 5 people tied to the tracks. You can't destroy life, even if that is part of the goal of maximizing life, because you have to honor life. You have to, you know, act in such a way that you never interfere with it or never destroy it. So that's the sort of thing I have in mind there, is that, okay, we have these two moral theories which can agree on what sorts of states are valuable, but they disagree about how you ought to act with respect to the value. So yeah, I mean, I would say that if you tell me that pleasure is what's objectively valuable, I don't think that claim in itself is going to get you to an objective ought, to an objective obligation.
So I guess what I would say is that the pleasure or the well-being is half of the equation, and actually probably the less important half. The other half is diminishing suffering. I recognize that there are situations where potentially the only actions you can take are ones where you're going to do harm. And then what matters is, given the spectrum of potential actions, which action causes the least amount of harm. And so it's not just about maximizing well-being, but it's also about reducing harm and having a balance between the two. And so if I, unalive somebody, I'm using TikTok language, if I kill somebody to protect myself, yeah, I did something in a sense that, like, I had the right to protect myself. Not protecting myself would have been doing myself a sense of moral wrong. But I hurt somebody, I caused a person suffering, and in that sense, I also did something that was harmful to them. And so, I would still say that what I did was wrong, but in a sense justified given the actions I had available. Like, if I could have protected myself without hurting the other person, that is the option that I should have taken. Given my definition of morality functioning under the concern for diminishing suffering and maximizing well-being. So I don't know that a conflict of rights, or that an uncertainty about how to move across that board, is necessarily a problem in principle for what I'm saying. Maybe an issue in practice, figuring out how we navigate our, once we have these values, how we navigate that. But I think maybe the concern for diminishing suffering may narrow down the problem, if that makes sense.
I mean, I just don't see. I don't. So, like, I feel like what you had. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I missed something, but it seemed like what you had offered when you were explaining your framework was a claim about the means by which we can achieve pleasure and avoid suffering. And then the claim that, like, okay, pleasure is what's objectively good, suffering is what's objectively bad. But from that alone, I mean, I don't see how you're going to get to any sort of claim about what you ought to do. Yeah, I mean, so with respect to the kind of a case you gave there, well, yeah, sure. So, like, I might be attacked by somebody, I decide to defend myself, and I can certainly frame that in terms of, you know, diminishing suffering overall or something. But like maybe I'm, you know, maybe I have this more like rights-based view, and I think that I should just, you know, never commit any sort of violence against anybody else. I should never impose suffering on anybody else. So I just allow the attack to happen. A total pacifist. Again, what would be the error with that?
Well, I think the problem there would be that the principle of not causing harm would be you would not be applying that principle to yourself, and so I think there would be an inconsistency there about why should we apply.
But wait, where does this? So this is so that the principle of not causing harm is going to be different from the claim that harm is bad. So if you say like you ought not to cause harm, that's different from saying, so like where does that principle come from?
I would say that when we say we ought not to cause harm, that it is essentially we ought not to cause harm because causing harm is bad. What do we mean by bad? A word that describes the reality of this kind of experience. So I think it's the phenomenology that gives rise to the language. I think the language is secondary. The language describes.
Why? I mean, so you said you ought not to cause harm because it's bad. So let's just grant the objective value, right? How do you get, where's that step from, okay, it's objectively bad, so you ought not to do it?
Yeah, so I think that when we use words like good and bad or positive and negative, we are describing experiences that have an inherent reality to them. That it's not that it's like the word bad or good is arbitrary. It's like I have an experience of what it means to have a positive experience versus a negative one, and then I use those words, positive, negative, to categorize that reality. And so it's not that I need some external justification. All I need is the experience itself. You get what I'm saying?
Well, I'm not disputing that though. So I'm just granting you that I mean, for what it's worth, I don't agree with this, but I'm just kind of granting it for the sake of argument that
Sure.
The experience is bad and it's objectively bad and it's something we discover. So like, we can be realists about that. I'm just granting that for the sake of argument. I'm wondering how we get from this experience is objectively bad to, well, we ought to avoid it or we ought not to do it.
Right. I guess I'm trying to understand if that's not what we should mean by that. I don't know what ought means at that point. Like if we're not applying what we ought to do or not to do in the context of what these experiences are like, then what will we be doing when we're using those terms to begin with? Like what else would matter?
Well, I mean, I feel like, you know, I gave an example of how you can have two people who agree on what is objectively good and objectively bad, but then they disagree on how you ought to act with respect to it. So, and you can go, you know, there are more extreme examples. So like, okay, a utilitarian says you ought to promote pleasure, right? The Kantian would say, well, yes, pleasure is good, but it's not the case that you ought to just act in whatever way would promote pleasure. You ought to honor certain like constraints, such as, you know, people's right to life or whatever. And then on the other hand, you've got people like, you know, the Marquis de Sade who say, well, you ought to act in such a way as to increase suffering and brutality. I mean, that seems like a very unpleasant and repugnant sort of position, but I feel like I understand what he's saying. At least I feel like I understand it as well as I understand any other moral claim. It seems like, you know, okay, so we have someone like, so a utilitarian says pleasure is good and you ought to act in such a way as to maximize pleasure. So they're, you know, making this, I mean, the way I mean, maybe this is me speaking as an anti-realist, but if someone says you ought to do something, I suppose I tend to take that as being more like a kind of command, a prescription about, you know, how they want other people to behave. The utilitarian has this thing that they take to be objectively valuable and they want to see more of it. they're commanding other people to bring it about. They're saying yes to bringing about that thing. And on the other hand, you've got the Marquis de Sade. He agrees that pleasure is good, but his view is, well, I want to see more of the suffering. I want to see pain and violence and brutality. So I'm commanding that. And I don't know, it makes sense to me, again, at least as much as any sort of moral claim makes sense. I mean, but I think what I would say is that it seems like, I mean, I feel like you'd probably run into some trouble if you were to deny. I mean, maybe you say that the example of the Marquis de Sade is like just too extreme and that's completely incoherent. Fair enough. But I think the distinction between like utilitarianism and Kantianism, I mean, if you have a theory that can't, make that coherent, then I don't know, maybe that's fine. That's not necessarily a problem, but it would be.
I would say that the Sade example would be equivalent in my mind to the person claiming that they are healthy while eating fast food and doing drugs all day long. Like it would just be almost by definition at that point, not within the category or the project that we would call morality. And in the context of the utilitarian versus the ontologist, I think, again, what I'm wondering is, when we look at both the well-being and the diminishing of suffering, couldn't we compare and contrast worldviews and kind of sort out? Maybe you may be, because I think you mentioned you're a skeptic of epistemology, so maybe this would be also a problem here. But I guess what I'm wanting to say is that in comparing these different approaches, we would find that some views have more inconsistencies or flaws than other views, more or less epistemic virtues. And so we could still point to why a moral theory is better than another when we recognize that suffering and well-being and how to navigate that space is what we mean when we're engaging in the moral project. But I'll definitely think about what you're saying. I mean, I think it's an interesting response you're providing that I need to kind of examine a little bit more. Mike, do you want to add anything as well? I know you're.
No, I don't know if you guys are where you're wanting to go on the metaethics, or if you're wanting to go any further, or if you want to move into anything else that you had before we, I guess, touch on scientific realism or anti-realism. I don't know what we'll discuss there. I mean, I'm interested in what you think about like the no miracles or miracles argument, the kind of standard stuff. But yeah, I don't know. Where do you want to take it, Cease?
It's up to you. Kane, was there anything else you wanted to add in this part of the discussion, or did you want to move on to a different topic?
I don't mind. I mean, it's up to you.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So maybe we can, and obviously I would love to have you back at some point and talk more about these things. But yeah, maybe you could tell us about your view of scientific realism and anti-realism, like where you fall on that front.
Yeah, well, I'm an anti-realist in this context as well. I think these days I'm probably an anti-realist about basically everything. In this case, though, I changed my mind. When I started out in philosophy, I was very much on the realist side with respect to scientific realism. And it was during my degree, when I was doing my dissertation during my degree, I started out writing a dissertation in defense of realism. And then in the course of writing that, I changed my mind. Why don't
we, sorry to interrupt, why don't we, for the audience that might be thinking we're talking about whether or not science is real or something.
Yeah.
Because we don't, I don't want to assume we have an audience that, sits in their room all day and nerds out on this stuff like we do, but
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. Do you want to maybe give a
mean,
quick synopsis of
somebody
positions?
who had like a person who had experience, creating YouTube videos for a wide audience would have probably just done this automatically, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, the good thing is you technically don't have to in a sense, because in the description we'll have Kane B's YouTube channel, and there's playlists in there, and there's two videos of moral naturalism that you can go watch that are great. I've taken a bunch of notes like from like 2 or 3 years ago. I still have on my computer that I love to go to. A lot of good stuff there. But yeah, go ahead, Kane. I'll let you continue.
So okay, yeah. So scientific realism, scientific anti-realism is it's basically a view, a debate about the sort of scope of scientific knowledge, the scope and limits of scientific knowledge. The scientific realist would say something like, there is a mind-independent world. Scientific theories attempt to give us descriptions of how that world works, and we are justified in believing that those theories are true. At least we're justified in believing that our best scientific theories are true. And obviously different realists are going to have different views about what exactly count as our best scientific theories, but you're basically looking at the theories that have been well established. They've been very well tested, and they're parts of mature sciences. So things like the modern evolutionary synthesis, general relativity, right? But these sorts of very well established theories, we have good reason to believe that they provide us with true descriptions of just the way the world works. And then anti-realism is, anti-realism is very heterogeneous, because an anti-realist will be anybody who denies realism, and there are many ways of denying realism. Historically, there were a fair number of philosophers who would have denied that theories should even be interpreted as attempting to provide like descriptions of the world. So this was fairly popular among the logical positivists. They would have said that actually, when a theory, we might have a claim about like electrons or something, but really all that amounts to is a claim about what you would observe under particular conditions. So, to say that there's an electron in the cloud chamber is really just to say something like there's a white streak in the cloud chamber. That kind of view isn't really so popular anymore. So, an anti-realist these days is more likely to say, well, we're just not justified, right? Like, yes, our best theories are attempting to provide true descriptions of the way the world works, but we're not justified in believing that they're true. So we're not justified in believing that there really are electrons, black holes, laws of nature, things like that. Now, what exactly is it that science provides? Well, again, different anti-realists will have different views here, but I suppose generally speaking, I guess that the general sort of position would be, what you get in science are theories that allow us to predict, systematize, control, the phenomena. So, there are certain things that like we want theories that will deliver correct predictions about what we actually can just observe. So, we want it to make the right prediction about whether or not I'll observe a streak in the cloud chamber. And we want theories that allow us to, build technologies and, build rockets to the moon and things like that, right? So that's broadly speaking the realist, anti-realist debate. Did that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and then and then carry on into you were at the time I interrupted. You were talking about you started as kind of a realist and then moved in to anti-realist position.
Sure. Yeah. That was my trajectory. I began as a realist, and then I found the arguments for it unconvincing, and so I ended up shifting to a kind of anti-realism. So that was really all I had to say about where my views were.
Concise, I like it. Yeah, and so what did that? Was there anything in particular that move, or I don't know, maybe there's something more straightforward you want to say on why you would think scientific anti-realism is false? I'm sure that the views developed over time for you, so I don't know if you want to take it on a linear progression, or if you'd just like to start at where you think the best kind of argument goes, or where scientific realism fails, maybe with no miracles, or however you want to take it.
Yeah, so the standard argument for realism is what's known as the no miracles argument. It sometimes feels like that might be the only argument for realism. I don't think that's entirely fair, but you know, when one reads the realist, anti-realist literature, it does seem to all come back to this no miracles argument. The no miracles argument is basically it's an inference to the best explanation. So what we would say is that, like, look, the sciences have been remarkably successful, and the best explanation for the kind of success that you find in the sciences is that those theories are true. It's that they have, you know, latched on to the facts about how the world works. So they're successful in that they will deliver correct novel predictions, where a novel prediction is a prediction of, like, some phenomena that would be otherwise unexpected. So think about how, you know, general relativity predicts a very specific value of light deflection by the sun, and then that very, very specific, very precise prediction, that there was no other reason, you know, to expect that value of light deflection by the sun. But then, you know, people went out and they looked at the positions of stars during eclipses and when the sun wasn't there, and it turns out the prediction of general relativity was confirmed. Or think about the you know, the periodic table, right? When Mendeleev first proposed the periodic table, he was able to use that to predict the existence of elements that had otherwise been unknown, and he was able to predict their properties, and that prediction came true. That's remarkable, right? It's a remarkable success. And if you ask, like, well, like, how was that possible? How is it possible that these theories exhibited this success? The natural answer is, well, because they're correct, right? They got to the truth. If you give a true description of the way the world is, obviously your predictions will be correct. So that's one example of, like, success that might be thought to justify our belief in the truth of theories. Similarly, you can look at the success of technologies. So the fact that, you know, we use our theories to build things like electron microscopes, and then the electron microscopes produce images, the sorts of images that, again, were predicted by the theories. You know, that there's this remarkable success, technological success. And so that's basically the core realist argument is, well, the best explanation for the success of contemporary science is that at least some of our theories are getting at the truth. The reason why it's called the no miracles argument was because it was Hilary Putnam who famously said that it would be a miracle if science exhibited this kind of success, but it just turned out that, like, the theories were false, right? That would just be completely miraculous. So that's where that no miracle title comes from. So yeah, that's the case for realism.
Yeah. And what immediately kind of sticks out, at least to you, on why that isn't successful?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of problems I have with this type of argument. I mean, so first of all, just a sort of initial, like, kind of immediate worry that was raised about this type of argument was, well, there seem to be plenty of cases of theories that exhibit success, but which aren't true. And the reason why we can say that they aren't true is because we have other theories that are even more successful that contradict them. So, you know, classic example would be Newtonian mechanics versus general relativity. Newtonian mechanics was incredibly successful, at least during the 1800s. I mean, that was one of the most well-confirmed scientific theories that there has ever been. In fact, I think Newtonian mechanics is, to this day, it's still much more successful than theories in many other fields of science. I imagine that, psychologists, for instance, would probably kill their own grandmothers for a theory as successful as Newtonian mechanics. So
yeah, especially since it's so like the amount of money and we generate in revenue based off the success of it with different applications. Yeah.
I mean, this is an important point, right? So to this day, we still use Newtonian mechanics. This is like, if you want to send a probe to Pluto, you don't use general relativity to work out the equations. You use Newtonian mechanics. So I'm told. I myself haven't sent any probes to Pluto, but I am told that the reason is obviously because Newtonian mechanics provides us with very accurate descriptions of how objects behave within certain, masses and velocities and so on. And it's just it's simpler, right? Like it's easier to use. Okay, so Newtonian mechanics, remarkably successful. And I mean, obviously what you might say about that is, well, okay, Newtonian mechanics is surely like it's getting at the truth in some sense. So you might say, well, it's approximately true. And I mean, in some respects, Newtonian mechanics, of course, it's approximately true, because it does provide us with reasonably, remarkably accurate descriptions of how objects behave, again, within certain range of masses and velocities. But if you look at what Newtonian mechanics says about the underlying structure of space and time, so it's claims about the nature of space and time and mass and gravity, it's just wrong. I mean, it's just incorrect, right? So okay, that's one example. That's one example of a theory which turns out it was displaced. Remarkably successful, but it was displaced. Moreover, if you look at, I think what I find perhaps even more compelling is that if you look at contemporary science, you find a very significant role for idealizations. So, like, even within contemporary science, we don't have to go into the past. We can just look at what contemporary theories do. And, if you want to, let's say, for instance, you're modeling the sun. Well, very often scientists will model the sun as an ideal gas, where an ideal gas is going to be composed of dimensionless molecules that have no intermolecular friction. There is nothing in the world that's actually like an ideal gas. That completely, there's no real gas on, the underlying molecular level would be viewed as being anything like an ideal gas. In fact, I suppose if you imagine dimensionless, like, point particles, that might not even be logically possible. You might think that there's something that's not even a possible state of affairs. I guess that's another thing. But anyway, certainly that's not the actual state of affairs. Maybe I shouldn't say certainly, but we think that that's not the actual state of affairs. So okay, it's an idealization, but this idealization is used when we construct models of the behavior of the sun. Like if you want to model things like I don't know, convection currents in the sun or something like that, you might model it as being an ideal gas that is composed of hydrogen. So you idealize, right? You treat it as this ideal gas, and that's false. And scientists are constantly appealing to these sorts of idealizations in their modeling, and so it seems like, moreover, these idealizations play a role in what makes these models successful. So we have success where this is actually connected to falsehood.
Would you say it's like the best of a bad lot, is I think how it's been phrased? I can't remember who's quoted on that, but it's kind of like you're just left with this best theory of a bad lot of them.
Slightly different things. So I guess what I would say is well, we can undermine these. So I'm basically saying, look, we can undermine the success to truth inference, because that's what the realist wants to do, right? The realist wants to make this inference from the success of our theories and models to their truth, and we can undermine that inference by showing, all right, well, actually, look, there's a bunch of theories and models where falsehoods appear to be playing an essential role in what makes them successful.
I see.
So, that seems to undermine that inference. Now, this idea of the best of a bad lot, this is a much more general objection to inference to the best explanation. Yeah,
in general. Okay, yeah, sure.
So inference to the best explanation is a type of inference where basically, you have some sort of puzzling phenomena, you have something you want to explain, and you generate a bunch of possible explanations, and then you assess those explanations according to certain explanatory virtues. So, simplicity, explanatory power, consistency, empirical adequacy, etc. So something like when you say, for instance, okay, we're going to appeal to Occam's razor, like we favor this explanation because it is simpler, you're probably engaging in a kind of inference to the best explanation there. Anyway, regardless of what you take the explanatory virtues to be, inference to the best explanation runs into this problem known as the problem of the bad lot, which is, well, even if it's the case that that this method of inference would get us to the truth, it's only going to get us to the truth if the truth is among the explanations that we have considered, right? So even if we have, even if we think that the explanatory virtues are a good method for picking out the truth, they can only pick out the truth if the truth is among the explanations.
Yeah, if the theory is among the, okay.
Yeah. And so the reason why this would be relevant to the scientific realism thing is because, well, if one considers the history of science, it looks like
most of them are
really
false.
Tough, to come up with scientific theories. We generally don't generate all that many scientific theories, right? When we're it's hard to come up with even one theory that seems adequate, let alone many of them. And so the worry is that when we say that a scientific theory is true, we're just inferring to the best of a bad lot.
Something that I wanted to kind of push back on a little bit is this idea that, what does it mean for the next theory to be more successful than the prior one, right?
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Newtonian physics, and it's not again, I'm not a physicist. I would love to maybe bring you back on when my brother is here, because he's a physicist. But as I understand it, it's not that relativity came along and all Newtonian physics was thrown out the window. It's that the new theory, in some sense, enveloped the prior theory and was able to explain why it is that the prior theory was successful, and then also why it failed to be successful. And so in some way it feels like, maybe we can't say that this theory is true, but we could say that we're making progress towards some truth, right?
So I think that I mean, first of all, obviously, I would agree that it's not like Newtonian mechanics has been just thrown out in the way that some theories have. There are cases of theories that seem to be basically thrown out. I mean, phlogiston theory, nobody talks about phlogiston anymore. Of course, even with phlogiston theory, we can use our contemporary, phlogiston being the theory of combustion that was around in the 16 and 1700s. We can now use contemporary chemical theories, the contemporary kinetic theory of heat, to explain why phlogiston theory was successful and to explain why it failed. Similarly, with Newtonian mechanics, Newtonian mechanics is still around. People still use Newtonian mechanics, and we can use general relativity to explain, okay, this is why it was successful and this is why it failed in the areas that it failed. But I'm not sure how to in what sense that really gives us a defense of the realist position. I mean, it seems to me that so in other words, the dialectic is that the realist has said, okay, the reason why we should believe that our best theories are true is because they are so successful. And then we're saying, well, look, there's this theory that is very successful, but even you agree that it's not true. So at least it's not true with respect to its claims about the underlying, structure and nature of the universe, which is where the dispute sort of lies with respect to contemporary theories, right? So okay, that's what's being said. Now the claim then is, well, yeah, but general relativity will explain why Newtonian mechanics failed. It will account for the context in which it's successful, account for the context in which it failed. I mean, well, sure. That's just to say that it seems like, of course, a theory which is true, right? If we had a theory which was true, then it would do that job, right? So like if we had a theory that we could be confident was actually true, then we would expect the true theory to explain why certain false theories are successful in the context that they are. But the mere fact that we have a theory that does that job doesn't show that it is the true theory. I mean, one way you could see this is to notice that Newtonian mechanics can do the same things with respect to like Aristotelian physics. Newtonian mechanics can explain why it's successful in certain contexts and why it fails in others.
But it's why I mentioned that it's not to say that the next theory is like the absolute truth, right? Obviously not. Even if it was, we wouldn't know it, that it was that, right? But it's the idea that it at least seems like we're making some progress towards some better understanding, not necessarily the complete or true understanding, but that we're making some progress, that we're not just in the dark, going in circles. There is some progress of some sort being made. I don't know whether or not you think that that's true or not.
Yeah, I think anti-realists can account for the idea of progress. I mean, one way in which we have progress is we're going to be getting theories that provide more and more precise predictions. And so, in other words, they give us, we might say, true descriptions of what we observe. And general relativity provides better predictions in that respect. I mean, Newtonian mechanics fails to give a good description of things like the precession of Mercury's perihelion, but general relativity gets that perfectly. So we have progress in that sense. Another way in which we have progress is things like greater puzzle solving power. I mean, when we face certain practical problems or just maybe kind of intellectual questions about how these theories work, like over time, we can solve these puzzles. We can apply these theories to achieve practical ends. So there are many ways in which there is scientific progress. Or at least I think an anti-realist can be quite comfortable with the idea that there is scientific progress. I mean, anti-realism isn't a matter of being anti-science. It's all the anti-realist is saying is we're just not justified in thinking that these theories are actually true. That's all. So yeah, like science is, an anti-realist can think that science is absolutely wonderful and that it's maybe even, the best, perhaps even the only tool that we have for, penetrating into how the world works. The anti-realist just doesn't think we penetrate quite as far as the realist does. But yeah, that's the dispute.
Mike, was there anything you wanted to add? Any other questions about this particular?
On this, no. I mean, if anybody in the audience has any questions, and I guess I'll be doing Rebecca a favor to move the fuck away from science, apparently. So we'll do her a favor. But if anyone has questions on that, or anything else on, maybe we can even go back to the metaethics discussion if someone has a question there. I'm on the scientific anti-realism. I think I'm good, but Cease, I don't know if you had. Oh, actually, I did have one thing, and this is kind of random. And Kane, if you don't have a prepared response, feel free to not answer. But I remember going through one of your videos where you were going over the Phil paper survey, and you got to the analytic-synthetic distinction. And you said that you don't agree that there's an analytic-synthetic distinction. And not to say like you just moved on without you obviously it's a long survey. But I was curious, do you have like any reason why you're not convinced by the analytic-synthetic distinction, or is there anything that sticks out to you?
I actually made 2 videos on this.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yeah, because there was an earlier Phil Papers survey and a later one. And when I answered the later Phil Papers survey, I basically just skipped very quickly over the questions that I had already answered in the earlier
Okay,
survey. So that might be why I didn't really elaborate that much. So
Sure.
I mean, with respect to the analytic-synthetic distinction, it's basically because I am inclined to endorse a sort of, indeterminacy of meaning kind of position. And I think if there are no determinate meaning, for a statement to be analytic, of course, is for it to be true in virtue of meaning. I'm not sure that, strictly speaking, there is anything that's true in virtue of meaning. And therefore, I reject the distinction. That's the basic reason why.
I see. So that's similar to like a Quinean type of.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think I come at it maybe from a slightly different perspective from Quine. Quine's arguments for the indeterminacy of meaning were there's a bit. They seem to rely. I mean, maybe I'm getting this wrong, but I feel like they rely a bit too much on a kind of behaviorism, which is not. I don't necessarily have a problem with it, but it's just not the sort of thing I would want to appeal to, because these days it's
out of fashion.
Nobody, yeah, it's out of fashion, right?
Yeah.
But I think that so I mean, there's a few things to say. So first of all, there's the fact that, like, okay, my take on concepts would be, actually, let me approach it this way, right? So let's say that you take a claim like all swans are white, right? And then you imagine, okay, so we've observed a bunch of swans, we take it that all swans are white, and then we travel to another country and we observe a black bird that looks very much like a swan. And then the question is, well, does this refute the claim that all swans are white? Now, in my view, there isn't really any fact to the matter about that, because there isn't really any fact to the matter what swan actually means. So in other words, if you say that the observation refutes that claim, you would be saying, well, it's sort of a determinate fact prior to making that observation that the word swan like correctly applies to these blackbirds that have all these features of swans. But there's obviously like 2 ways you could take this. You could say, well, this thing is a swan that is black, and therefore it refutes the claim that all swans are black. Or you could take it that, well, this just isn't a swan, right? Because it's not black. And I don't think there's actually any fact of the matter what swan means prior to making that observation. So I don't know if that case makes. That's a sort of more intuitive way, I guess, that I would.
That makes sense to me, for sure.
Yeah. So that's why I tend to say, like, meaning is indeterminate. There's no fact of the matter what the extension of our concepts is, where, like, so what our concepts actually apply to.
Are you a nominalist?
I was thinking. Oh, sorry, Cease.
I was just going to ask: Are you a nominalist?
I think that I would have a kind of constructivist view of objects in general, and so I tend to think that even with respect to concrete objects, there's like a process of abstraction that goes on. So I would say, for instance, that with I have 2 hands. Well, in saying that I have 2 hands, I think that I'm idealizing and abstracting.
There's like no demarcation on where your hand starts and.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So like, where exactly is the line between the hand and the arm?
Yeah.
And similarly, you get problems like the problem of the many, where okay, my hand is made up of billions and billions of molecules, or so our best scientists say. You could sort of draw a line around those billions of molecules. You could also draw another line where you remove just one of the molecules.
Right.
Well, it looks like that's going to count as a hand as well. And so if you go through that argument, then it ends up looking like I have not two hands but trillions of hands. So I actually find these sorts of arguments quite persuasive. I mean, but what I want to say is well, I have two hands is true, but it's kind of idealized. It's a sort of useful idealization, and so it is a kind of abstraction. And therefore, even when it comes to concrete objects, like there's the abstract within the concrete. I don't think there's a strict distinction between like concrete objects and abstract objects. And so I guess I'm on the fence about. I'm not sure. I don't know whether.
I see.
I'm just curious.
With the object, like with a constitution. Well, like, would you say? I guess I'd just ask it this way. Like, would you say that objects have proper parts, or do you hold like a mereological nihilist position, or?
I mean, look, I think there are hands. I'm happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I figured it wasn't really
playing around with like radical skepticism or something. But
sure.
I mean, other than that, I'm happy to say that there are hands, there are tables and chairs, and they seem to be like perfectly legitimate objects. They're just they're just idealized, and
sure,
that's fine, right?
Would you say that this view is incompatible with a physicalist perspective?
I don't know, because I'm not entirely sure what physicalism is actually committed to. I mean, the issue that I wouldn't call myself a physicalist, but I think that I think you could probably make this consistent with some sort of physicalism.
That's what I think too. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose what I've said about like macro scale objects, like hands and tables and chairs, I can imagine there being physicalists who say, well, like all there really is in the world is well, maybe not all there really is, but they would say, well, like the fundamental things, all there really is fundamentally is fermions and bosons, and there's just and then like, is there really a table here? Well, there's this kind of collection of fermions and bosons, and there's a certain pattern in the world. Dan Dennett has a really nice paper called Real Patterns, which I suppose is sort of what I'm hinting at here, where like the idea would be, I can sort of show you a pixel image, for instance, and the pixel image might have like the face of Einstein, and you're like, well, is that like a perfect representation of the face of Einstein? Well, I mean, presumably you'd want to say no, because it's kind of in black and white, and because actually if you look at it really closely, it just becomes a mess of pixels. But if you kind of hold it far away, then you're like, I recognize a pattern, like something in your brain lights up, and it's like, yes, that's Einstein. Well, in the same way, there's these sort of more or less idealized patterns in the fermions and bosons. So I suppose if a physicalist had a view like that, then that would be maybe similar to what I'm saying, I guess. Yeah.
So I have a question that's really unrelated, but I'm just curious. What do you think about theories of self, and what do you think? Like, do you think that the cogito is successful in grounding some concept of I, or do you agree with, I think it's Russell, who believes that it ultimately actually fails to do what it set out to do?
Yeah, I don't think it's. I think I'd agree with Russell. It seems to me that it's presupposing that there's an I, a self, but that doesn't seem to me to be just given by the fact of thinking. So like something thinks, there is thinking occurring. I think that's the most you're going to get. And actually, I don't think you even get that, because eliminative materialism is entirely plausible in my view. So it might
That's
be the
what I
case
was going to
that,
ask you.
yeah.
Exactly what I was going to ask you was if we get ourselves to what I think Cease wants to go to, that there is some experience that seems to presuppose like qualia or qualitative experience, and presumably I lay out these reasons or whatever. Like, say I give an argument, it really doesn't matter that I dressed up, these statements or propositions in argument form when the reasons turn out to be parasitic on the conclusion, right? The eliminist has no reason to accept the view. And so I was curious what you thought about that.
Can you expand on that view a little bit? So, like, what is that position?
You're talking about eliminativism of, well, if all I'm saying is that, say you're like, you're having this conversation with somebody about the cogito, and you're just saying like, well, look, I'm not referring when I say I to like me, or in fact, take ontology out of it or whatever metaphysical view. Like it could be like me as the extension of the Cartesian demon, or maybe it's idealism or physicalism or whatever, right? All I'm saying is that there's some experience. Well, the eliminativist presumably is like, well, I mean that's just quite like that reason is like, parasitic on the idea that there's. It just assumes the falsity of my eliminativism, right? It assumes the falsity that, because they would have no reason to accept that, right? Because they're not going to think that there are qualitative.
But then what is? But I don't know how you can.
I mean, it's not my view. I
Sure.
think that's just what Kane's saying, right? It's just presumably you'd have no reason for them to accept that, because they're going to deny that.
It's not my view either, but I think that in the context in which the cogito is given, it doesn't really have to be, because the whole point of it, at least as I understand Descartes' project, is he's trying to find a foundation for knowledge that is indubitable.
Sure.
Now it's one thing to say that eliminative materialism is false. It's another to say that it's just totally indubitable. And I mean, I don't have that strong of an opinion on it. I think it's I think it I consider it to be on the table.
My question is always like, what does it mean for something? What does it mean to experience? What does it mean for there to be thought, right? And I'm also saying that gives us a clear idea of what the I is, right? Like, I'm not making a claim about the ontology of the self, but that there is a self having an experience. I don't see how we get underneath that in a way that isn't leading to more problems. But yeah, I was just curious.
Wait, I just would wonder. So, I mean, again, if we're just looking at this in the context of something like the cogito, so let's say that any attempt that we make to elaborate a view on which there is no self leads us to a whole bunch of problems. I mean, okay, but would that mean that we can be certain that the view isn't false? I mean, the mere fact that a view has problems doesn't seem like I'm going to say I'm certain that it's false. I mean, every philosophical view has problems. So I guess I think for something like the cogito to be successful, Descartes would need to he'd need to show that it is just indubitable that there is a self that is thinking. Like, I think, and I don't.
I can read. I'll read you something from. I don't know if you're familiar with. I think you pronounce his name Jaakko Hintikka.
Is this the non-inferential?
Yeah, he wrote
interpretation or whatever.
Yeah. He argues that the cogito should be understood non-inferentially, as a performative utterance. So on his analysis, the statement "I exist" doesn't follow logically from "I think," nor does Descartes suppose otherwise. But instead, the transition from "I think" to "I exist" is non-logical. The key point here is that it is the very act of thinking, like the cognitive performance, is existentially incoherent. I cannot both think the statement and believe it to be true. Meaning that, if so, what is this? This is when someone says "I'm thinking," therefore I am or I exist. there's something. He's saying there's something self-evident about that.
Yeah, I agree with that interpretation. So of what Descartes' doing, like it really should be not I think therefore I exist, but I think I exist, all in one, just one thought.
One thought. Yeah.
But the thing is so you made this point about how, well, to deny that would involve some sort of like incoherence. But I mean, from the point of view of, say, an eliminative materialist, I'm not sure why that would really be a problem. So if it's like it could be the case that like the whole framework of of interpreting these things in terms of like thoughts is just defective. So that if you were to kind of deny the proposition that that like there is thinking, or that I think, that's in some sense conceptually incoherent, but that's not necessarily going to follow that there actually is thinking. So a good example of this would be, okay, this is an example from science, so bringing it back to the science thing, like phlogiston, right? Phlogiston is just by definition something that is released during combustion. So if I say that, well, there is no phlogiston being released during combustion, then somebody who's looking at that from the framework of the phlogiston theory will say, well, yeah, it's just totally incoherent. That doesn't make any sense. But of course, we don't have to get on board with that framework. We can throw out the whole thing. We can throw out the whole conceptual scheme. And I take it that that's what the eliminative materialist is saying should happen with the conceptual scheme of folk psychology.
Sure. Well, Mike, I don't know if you have any questions, or if anybody in the audience wants to ask anything before we wrap it up. Feel free to leave it in the comments.
No, I mean, I've been struggling with tech all night, and I've been hovering at 4% on my crappy phone that won't charge ever. So, and I want to be. I mean, it's been hanging on, so I'm good, and I could always just rush back to the computer. But I want to be sensitive to Kane's time considerations. So, yeah, I guess I'll leave it there.
I don't mind for what it's worth. I'm not. I don't have any other plans for tonight, so it's up to you guys.
Imdir wants to know, Kane, do you have any thoughts about Grim Reapers and causal finitism?
I don't. I haven't read anything about the Grim Reaper stuff, so you'd have to explain exactly what that argument is supposed to be if you want my opinion on it. As for causality, I mean, I'm kind of on the causal anti-realist side. So I think that I sort of just don't get on board with either side of that particular debate. So yeah.
I was going to say, if nothing else, you're consistent.
Yeah. Well,
no.
I'm also sympathetic to dialetheism, so I'm not consistent.
I see. Okay.
True contradictions.
Don wants to know, what can I do to convince you of mathematical Platonism?
Yeah, it's an interesting question of like, what arguments, or like, what could you be shown that would change your mind and make you believe this thing? I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I like, when it comes to numbers, I think I might actually be a kind of Platonist. Maybe not the sort of Platonist that you would want me to be, because I'm probably not going to say that numbers are like mind-independent entities. But I think that numbers exist in just as legitimate a sense in which I can say that ordinary objects exist. And numbers are just a sort of higher degree of abstraction from the sort of perceptual phenomena, right? So like, when as I said earlier, like I say I have two hands, I mean, that is something which I'm like constructing out of what I'm perceiving in my view. I don't think it's the case that there are like mind independent objects that like really exist. There are like two things that really exist. No, what's happening is like I am drawing lines not necessarily intentionally, right? Like I've just, you know, my mind works a particular way, and I've been brought up to use language a particular way. And so, you know, I draw lines in such a way that I say I have two hands. Now, then you can kind of shift to this higher degree of abstraction where you just start talking about the relations between like 2 and other numbers. So I start off with like, okay, I have two hands, and then I can just think, well, okay, what about two-ness? And more abstractly. And that seems, again, if we're going to say that there are two hands, I'd be quite happy to say that there is 2. There is the number 2. I think we can talk about that and talk about its properties just as legitimately as we can talk about the properties of hands. So maybe I already am a Platonist. Now, if you were wanting to convince me of traditional Platonism, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I'm really not sure. I feel like that would require pretty radical changes in my, you know, my like approach to epistemology. You know, the way just the way I think about things. So it's really hard to say. You know.
Well, so Malpass calls. I'm sure you're familiar with Alex Malpass, right?
I mean, I don't know his work in that much. I don't know a lot about philosophy of religion, but I'm aware of Alex Malpass.
Yeah, I just didn't want to make sure I was using a foreign name. I think he describes his Platonism as like small p Platonism. Yeah. Is that still too strong? If you even understand like what I mean by that?
No, I mean, look, I think that might be fine. It depends. It always depends on what exactly we mean by this, right? I feel like. I think there's going to be a lot of people who would say, well, you know, no, what Kane is describing there is just a kind of anti-realism, which is fair enough. I mean, I would say that it pretty plausibly is, because my approach is basically constructivist. But you know, again, it's like if we all agree that there are ordinary objects, and I am willing to say that, you know, there are hands and tables and trees and fields, then I'm saying, okay, fine, you can have numbers in the same sense. I mean, I would actually say that I am a kind of, if you really wanted a label, I'll give you a label. I will say a Carnapian Platonist. So, you know, that Carnap, of course, so he sort of has this approach where he distinguished between like internal and external questions. So if you imagine it, so if you take the discourse of mathematics, right, then you can ask a question like, are there prime numbers? And if you approach that as an internal question, well, the way that you establish that there are prime numbers would be by, you know, just giving a mathematical proof. So if I want to know, like, okay, are there prime numbers greater than 100? Well, I can give a mathematical proof that, you know, the number 101 is a prime number, and of course the number 101 is greater than 100. So there you go, prime number greater than 100. Now, what we want to do in philosophy is like step outside of that discourse, and we want to say, well, like, is there some entity corresponding to the numbers? I mean, what I would be quite happy with is that, yeah, you know, there are these different frameworks we can have. There are these discourses we have. Within those discourses, you know, we construct objects. You have the ordinary object discourse, you have the arithmetic discourse, and a whole bunch of others. And in that sense, okay, yeah, there are numbers, but that's as far as I'll go. So
sure.
We do the last 3 questions here.
Oh, we got a couple of them actually.
Indier asks, can you explain a bit about what you take causal realist and anti-realist to be disagreeing about?
I'll put it up on the screen in case you want to.
Yeah, I mean, I would see this as so, like a causal realist will want to say that causality is a kind of objective, mind-independent relation between entities in the world, or, you know, it's like a process, right? In the mind-independent world, we can describe it, you know, correctly or incorrectly, independent, and so that the facts about causality are whatever they are, independently of our interests or of the way that we think about things. So, you know, if you have a billiard ball rolling along a table and it hits another billiard ball, the billiard ball rolls away, then you might say, okay, there is this kind of causal, there's like a glue, there's like a metaphysical glue connecting these two events together. And I mean, a causal anti-realist is just going to be anybody who denies that sort of position. So, you know, the classic causal anti-realist would be somebody like Hume. Hume would say, well, all that there really is in the world is just basically correlations, or what he would call constant conjunctions. So we observe a ball rolling along a table, and then it connects with the second ball rolls away. We observe that sort of thing over and over again, and then this sets up this like habit of the mind. The mind comes to expect the second ball to roll away when it sees the first moving towards it, and we then project this expectation onto the objects themselves. We kind of gild and stain the world with our expectations, and that's what causality is. So that would be a kind of causal anti-realism. I hope that was very brief, but hopefully that's...
No, yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
The Inquiry was the first book that I ever bought and read in philosophy, and it was a mistake. Like, I mean, I do this joke with people that you can go pick up an Inquiry, open it up to any page, and stick your finger anywhere in the book, and there will be four commas, 3 semicolons, and 2 colons before you get to a fucking period. It's dreadful. Like, it's absolutely dreadful. I love Hume, but I had to rely on commentary of his work for a very long time before I could go back to it.
I like Hume's writing. I don't know why, because I really hate most writing from that period. I really hate like Locke, for instance. There's just something about Hume which I think he has a very nice turn of phrase at times.
I think for me it was because I didn't know any of these terms.
Gild and stain, by the way, was from Hume, but he wasn't talking about causality there. He was talking about color, I think. But I've always liked that. That's a nice little phrase. You know, we gild and stain the world.
Yeah,
with colors.
I'm just curious.
I think it was just the terms. I just didn't know anything, so it was just the worst place for me to start. But sorry, Cease, go ahead.
Yeah.
Have you read any Deleuze?
No, I haven't.
You said who, Cease?
Deleuze.
Oh no,
he's completely incomprehensible to me. I don't know what is saying. I don't know if he's a genius or completely out of his mind. But I was just curious. Don wants to know.
Yeah, we got a couple more, right? Yeah. Here we go. Put it up.
Why is identity theory wrong? And can you explain both the type and token flavors?
Yeah. So, I mean, so to explain type and token identity theory, basically the type identity theorist would say that different types of mental states are identical to types of brain states. So, you know, they might say something like pain is identical to C fibers firing. That was always the classic example. That's not correct. Pain involves a lot more than C fibers. But so we have this type of mental state. You know, there's pains. Pains can be caused by all sorts of different things, of course. You know, I might burn my hand. I might, you know, get stabbed. I might just have like a psychosomatic pain, which isn't caused by any particular bodily damage. But then the idea would be that this type of mental state is just reducible to a type of brain state. So whenever I'm experiencing pain, there's going to be C fibers firing in my brain. The token identity theorist will say that, okay, types of mental states are not reducible to types of brain states, but for each specific mental state, that reduces to a specific brain state. So it might be that like I have a particular pain, which is identical to C fibers firing, and then I have another pain, which is identical to, you know, something else, D fibers, whatever else that may be. So that's the distinction there. As for why identity theory is wrong, I'm actually a lot more sympathetic to identity theory than most people. I think that most of the arguments against identity theory are quite weak. So the general consensus among philosophers of mind, I should say I haven't really done much philosophy of mind for years, so this is not my field, but there was a sort of period, I think in like the 60s, where people were quite attracted to identity theory.
Like Jack Smart and those guys.
Yeah. But then there were a bunch of arguments which led people to accept functionalism. So one of the most famous was the multiple realizability argument, which basically says, well, it seems like mental states in general can be realized by almost any physical state. So like a pain, for instance, okay, a human being can experience pain, but presumably an octopus can experience pain, and octopuses have very different sort of neural structures to what humans have. So if we can both experience pain, then it doesn't, we can't say that pain is identical to some specific physical state. Similarly, maybe we could, build robots that will experience pain. Maybe we could have like, a set of silicon chips that experiences pain. So that was taken to be a very serious problem for identity theory. I don't think that kind of argument works. And part of the reason why I don't think it works is because it seems to me that it's going to like depend very much on the sort of level of abstraction on which we classify different so like when we say, for instance, that an octopus could not be in the same physical state as a human, I'm not sure why we should accept that. It seems like if we give a sort of more structural description of some of the things going on in the octopus's physical state, maybe that would be on a sort of coarser grained level identical to what's going on in a human. And of course there are still going to be differences, but then it would not be surprising if you're describing things in a really fine grained way. It also would not be surprising if there were fine grained differences between human pain and octopus pain. In fact, we know that there are differences between different pains. It's not like all pains feel the same. The pain of burning your hand is not going to be the same as the pain of stabbing your hand. So yeah, I mean, the octopus, if we're describing the mental state really abstractly, like pain, then I think it would not be surprising if we could similarly find physical states that are described more abstractly, which are the same for both the human and the octopus. On the other hand, if we're describing the mental state in a super fine-grained way, well, I mean, then there's no problem with the fact that the human and the octopus would have different physical states. So that's my sort of brief summary of why I don't find the standard argument against identity theory very convincing.
Are you familiar with in like the 60s with, I think, guys like Jack Smart, who had this view of compatibilism between identity theory and functionalism? I know Graham Oppy in like contemporary philosophy today holds to the view. It seems like it's an Australian thought that Western thinkers seem to disagree with. I guess Putnam being one. But I was curious, are you familiar with that, or what do you think? Do you think there is a compatibility between identity theory and functionalism? Or do you think that'd be incompatible?
I'm not. I can't recall the details of this anymore. But I think that actually what I just said might be an example of how they're of like drawing a compatibility between them. So the idea would be that, well, there's different sort of degrees of abstraction on which we can describe these physical states and mental states, and the functional description is just going to be a relatively high level of abstraction. And so, that would be one way to make them compatible.
Sweet, awesome. That's great, good stuff.
Rebecca asks, how many pairs of shoes do you own?
I have one pair of shoes. So
I think I know why she asked that.
Well, we asked it because I've spoken to her about this.
Okay, I thought she was trying to say something else.
She was horrified to discover that. Well, I'm curious what you thought she was trying to say.
I think she thinks I have too many shoes and was trying to show me what the amount of shoes someone should have.
How many?
I think she's trying to make a normative assessment that I'm exceeding the limit, but I could just be paranoid, I guess.
Yeah. How many shoes do you have?
Probably close to like 70, just because of skate shoes that I went through for a long time, and I never like threw them away. But in terms of like rotation, like 17.
I mean,
Jesus,
that makes it sound like you're just a hoarder. Now,
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question, philosophically, whether like, okay, so do they count as shoes that you really sort of have? I mean, if they're not shoes that you're actually using, if you just happen to have hoarded them, is that really are they really shoes that are owned by you?
Yeah, it's more of history.
Yeah.
It's more like
Exactly.
I really like skate sneaker history, and especially because people tear their shoes and rip them up, throw them away. So a lot of models and stuff, they're lost to the sands of time, so to speak. And so it's a niche thing, but it's something I enjoy.
I remember
I don't expect anybody to understand it.
I remember when I got a new pair of shoes when I was in Georgia visiting, you immediately knew what brand it was. Like as soon as you saw me, and I was like, wow, that's impressive.
Yeah. Hey man,
But,
I didn't play sports or anything, but yes, it's just interesting to me. What else do we got?
Last question aimed here. Are you familiar with coherence metaphysics? And if so, do you have any thoughts on it?
I don't think so. No, I'm not. I don't think I've heard of that. I know about coherentism, about justification, coherentism about truth. I'm not sure what coherence metaphysics is.
All right. Well, I think this is a good place to end it for now. Kane, I would love to have you back at some point in the future. I thought this was a really enjoyable discussion.
Yeah, let me know anytime.
Yeah, and I'll definitely think about what you said about the meta ethics and get back to you.
Yeah, I would like to. I was gonna ask. It would be good to continue this. Maybe if we can just kind of cycle through some topics. I want to hopefully break, kind of like how you do, break these concepts down for people who don't really get into philosophy as much. But I think I'm just so lazy. It'd be really nice just to have people like yourself come on and just field questions or
yeah, no problem.
Kind of whatever's on your mind.
Well, guys, I thank you, Kane, for coming on. Guys, thank you for being in the audience and listening to us tonight. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your week. And I think I should be back on next week to discuss gender theory with a few people, with a few friends of mine. So, thanks everybody.
Yeah, and actually, sorry to do this, but Kane, did you? I might be getting confused with somebody else. Didn't you do a video on gender recently, or maybe I'm thinking of an AMA? You had a question.
It was. I mean, I did a video on it with someone else. I find the question interesting. It's not something that I'm really an expert on, though. So I had someone else on with me. That was over a year ago, though. And every time I do an AMA, there's somebody asking about gender. Yeah.
Sure. So, well, if that interests you, anybody, go check out Kane's videos or AMAs or whatever, and we appreciate it. And anything left for you, Cease?
No, just thanks everybody as always, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Axioms on Trial.
Peace out.